Okay, take two. In adjusting my camera mount here, I evidently turned off the movie, so we get to start from the beginning. I am in the process of trying to figure out how best to serve my customers by being neat and tidy about my pen repairs that often lay fallow, organize my nibs in a certain way so I know where they are, and also put my nibs into pens that are easier to keep track of than nibs all by themselves. So what I've done over the past couple of days is this. Let's see if I can get this down. What do you think? My little Ikebana bouquet. And I have, good pen sketchy, rubbery Waterman nibs. I've got really fine accountant nibs. I have less fine, very rigid nibs. Snappy, tight, springy, and sloppy. These are all flexible. These are flexible too, but these are better geared toward maybe calligraphers. These are geared towards sketchers. And one of my followers who knows how to think and dissect pen nibs and pens was asking me what the difference between snappy and springy and tight were. And they all are variants or adjectives that described certain aspects of the pen. Snappy is, in my terminology, I don't know if there's a word that better describes it, but it describes the quick return from 0 to 60 back to 0 again, where this little curve, when you go from the downstroke to the upstroke, it just snaps right back. And it's not really the nib returning to stasis, or whatever the word would be, returning to its resting position. It's also includes the amount of ink that's still residually on the nib tip. And it's more the shape of the nib, I think, that causes the slower return. And for me, the best, snappiest return, it's not quite right, but anyway, the snappiest return is when it goes back to 0 immediately. And some calligraphers really, really love that. Sketchers, probably not. Writers, probably not. So they're a relatively rare quality, and that maybe snappy is not the right word for it. Springy and tight. Tight describes the amount of pressure you need to actually get to the wide part. Some pens open up really fast. They're sloppy, wet noodly. They really are sort of hard to control because they're so flexible. So I call them sloppy. Now maybe I'm a sloppy writer and I don't know how to control my pen well enough, but I prefer to have more resistance. So springy offers sort of the standard resistance where this is not the right numbering system, but if I press down twice as hard as before, it gets twice as big. It's not quite that, but it's logical. It's a logical progression, an arithmetic progression. You add more pressure, you get a bigger line. You add the same amount of pressure, the line gets just that much bigger. Whereas sloppy, you add a little tiny bit of pressure and it goes from 0 to 1. And you add a little tiny bit more and it goes from 1 to 8. And so it's really hard to control because it's so fast in how it does that. And they're often very wet. They might have a broader nib to begin with. Springy is rubbery and consistent in how it behaves, and some might be more flexible than others, but the amount of pressure you apply seems to arithmetically progress the width of the nib. Whereas tight starts out really slow and you apply pressure and very little happens. It's the opposite of sloppy. It gets wide only when you add a lot of pressure. And there's a lot of feedback from the tight nib saying, I really do not, under any circumstances, want to do this. But if you insist, I will purr. You know, and then snappy. Any of these pens could be snappy in my book. It's the return. It goes back to 0. Accountant nibs can be snappy. They go from 0 to 1 and back to 0, but the going back to 0 happens really, really fast, and I call that snappy, I guess. Snappy, right back to 0. Whereas if they don't, it's more the shape of the nib, and there's ink that's residually left on the ball of the nib, which I think gets transferred to the paper. I could bring these pens over to MIT down the street and I could explain my problems, and the graduate class of the physics department and chemistry or whatever they have over there would say, oh, I don't even have to do the experiment. I know exactly what the problem is. Mr. Gustafson, they'd say. And they'd get their slide rule out and they'd figure it out immediately, and they'd say it's because of blah, 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 blah. Or if they didn't know the answer right away, they would tell me within a short amount of time. So Todd Merrill, who was the one that was sort of dissecting my filing system over there, was not seeing the difference between some of these. They are, maybe it's like there's another characteristic that's added to the pen. A pen can be flexible if it gets wider with pressure. A pen can be tight if the pressure comes in a certain way, and the pen can be tight, flexible type, and snappy if it goes back to 0. So all snappy pens are flexible. All tight pens are flexible. All springy pens, they're all flexible. But there's this one quality that I particularly like that I call snappy. And so that's it. I've been enjoying having these conversations live where I get to meet many of the customers that I've talked to through emails and sometimes on Facebook and sometimes on Instagram and sometimes on Skype. So I'm getting to know the personality of you guys better so I can better find a pen that I think you're going to like. I'd like to say that I know you're going to like it, but that would be too presumptuous of me. I am not infallible, of course, in guessing what you guys want, but I am pretty good after doing this and watching people write with their pens and on their YouTube channels to know, I think, a little bit about what you think is important. And many of you, I know, or I would hope, would get along really well with each other. So that's one of the reasons I'm doing this too, is to introduce Canada to Brussels. The reason I say Canada to Brussels is that everyone has different names on different platforms. You know, the Skype name that they used is not their real name, or it can be their real name. Other people have different names on YouTube chat than they do. You know, they might have joined YouTube for some sort of gaming they do, if there's such a group. Let's say there's a Dungeons and Dragons group and you're the wizard la-di-da in your game, so that's your name. Well, I don't know Wizard la-di-da is actually John Smith from Tucson, because I didn't know that side of you. So do I call you your wizardness now, or do I refer to you as John? And if I say John, people won't know who I'm talking about on the chatter. So I'll be using your chat name probably so that people know who I'm talking about. And that's going to confuse my poor little brain a lot, because I don't have enough brain cells to juggle everyone. So I'm wondering, as I'm looking at the pens I sorted out, whether, first of all, I'm going to try 3 of these out and they're going to be thrown in a different bin. Maybe I'll have the first bins be empty. They'll be for sorting. So if I put them back, I don't have to remember, because I might change my mind. I'll say, oh gee, this one really is snappy. And by putting this nib in a different feed, different pen altogether, it may act a little different. It will act a little different. It's bound to some degree, a little different. And it's going to end up being maybe, see, it's almost tight, but I put it in the springy bin. It really, it's also pretty snappy too. But I'll just leave it in springy. That's where I thought it would go. So these are Waterman pens. So what do I do for my Schaefer pens? Most Schaefer pens are pretty hard as nails. It's the Schaefer Feather Touch nibs that are the most diverse, I think. Or you see more diversity there, because I think because the nibs were thinner in cross section, they are all more flexible, and they had different tips on them, some fine, some broader, but they're quite different than the Lifetime nibs. The Lifetime nibs are almost all hard and rigid, and they might be fine or broad, but there's not as many categories in Schaefer pens. And in Parker pens, because of the fact that I don't really do Parker anymore, I love 51s, but I have many. I have more 51s than any other model of pen, and I know I have the parts that I can use to fix them, but I don't actively buy them to fix to sell, because people can get those all over the place, and they don't have the obvious subtleties available that I like, which are flexibility of a nib and things like that. So I find them less interesting to try to collect and sell. they're beautiful pens, and if I wish I had 100 to sell, because I would sell them immediately. But they're a little easier to sell, I think. What color do you want? Fine, medium, or broad? I know. Todd Merrill, don't start with me. I'm kidding. I know there's different caps and there's different, all this other stuff, colors and years and filling systems, but the nibs are generally pretty Johnny one notey. So I wouldn't need that for 51s. I might need 2 buckets, fine, medium nib. I can see without having to uncap it that it has a sterling cap on it. I can see that it's a gold fill cap, so I don't have to separate them like this. But the nibs, you really, the way I define nibs, I have to try them out. And if someone says they want a really fine nib, I know that I don't look in this bin. Fine rigid nib. I go way back there and I'll find what I want. I could probably do something like this with Schaefer. This has lots of empty buckets in it, so I may condense, put the Watermans over here, put the Schaefers over there, the Schaefer Feather Touch types, and maybe the Eversharp Skylines. And that way I can easily, and these would just be like this, barrels with the nib crammed in. This nib is not going to stay in this barrel. I put it there yesterday just to get it off the floor, and I can take it out tomorrow and put it in the pen. So the Eversharp one will just be probably crammed in barrels and feeds and sections of Skylines. And the Schaefers might be crammed in, just any plastic Schaefer pen. Chances are the Schaefer pens, if they're in a barrel already, they'll probably have a cap and they're